Welcome to another episode of Ehkili, Afikra's book club. Today on the series, I'm really excited because I get to speak to a friend of mine, as well as a friend of Afikra. Zahra Hankir is the author of a new book, which I have right here, Eyeliner, A Cultural History. She's also the person behind another book that we had on the series called Our Women on the Ground, Essays by Arab Women Reporting from the Arab World. Zahra, I'm really excited to have you back on Afikra. Welcome.
Thank you, Mikey. I'm so excited to chat. Thank you for inviting me again.
Yeah, of course. So for context, I want to take you back to a dinner that we had in Brooklyn, I think maybe 2 years ago, when we were chatting and you said, I think I have this idea for a book. I don't really want to talk about it because it's not fully fleshed out, and it's called Kohl, and I think it's a really good idea. I think it's actually like a rock star idea, a home run, but I haven't finished it. So give us some backstory on where the idea first came, and when did you actually finish working on this? When did you start? When did you finish?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I appreciate the reference to when we had dinner. I think at that point, I was really grappling with the idea of whether or not a book about eyeliner felt right in the moment, given there was so much going on. You know, it was the aftermath of the Beirut blast. We were in the midst of the pandemic. I think I was feeling quite unsure about not just appetite for the book itself, but just in general, is this something that I really wanted to devote 2 to 3 years of my time to, given how much trauma that there was in the region and beyond the region? And I felt that as well during the war. I'm feeling that now during the war in Gaza. My book actually came out in mid-November, so in the midst of the war, in the very early weeks of the war. And I think what I arrived at, with the help of my mother and some good friends that I spoke to, was that so often we focus on sort of stories of trauma and pain when it comes to coverage of the region, when culture is so important as well. Stories of culture and preservation of culture, and even cultural resistance. And we can talk a little bit about that later. And my mother just said, you have to write this book. You know, those stories are just as important. So I ended up deciding to commit to pursuing the book with my mother's gentle nudge. The gentle nudge of an Arab mother is more like a shove.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean.
But in terms of just, yeah, go ahead, Mikey, please.
No, I was going to say that, I mean, I'm nudging you along with your mother because, I mean, Afikra is an organization predicated on that very idea that, existence is resistance, and that, we find ourselves in the sort of the hallways and the alleyways of culture and sort of intellectual curiosity. That's actually where how we constitute our own personalities and how we constitute our societies. And so I'm very happy that you've contributed this. But continue with the idea. That. So where did it, how did it go from
and that's why we
a
all
small
love
idea
Africa,
to where we are?
I mean, initially the idea, I would say, let's start with my obsession with eyeliner and how that originated. So growing up in the UK, my parents had left Lebanon during the Civil War. And, my mother was always so overwhelmed. She had 6 children. She was constantly on the move. She was constantly stressed out. She was worried about her family back home, always watching the news and so on. But every morning she would apply eyeliner in this very sort of ritualistic way that to me kind of evoked many feelings as a young girl. Firstly, I was sort of in awe at how beautiful she looked after she applied her eyeliner, but I also felt there was something more happening. It was like she was engaged in this ritual, or she was connecting to something bigger than herself. And I understood even then that eyeliner had this connection to the East, or the global South, or the Swana region, however you want to refer to it. As we know, Kohl plays such a significant role in Arab culture. And, the materials used are different to the materials you might find are used for eyeliner in the West, which are highly processed materials. Kohl uses very natural ingredients. So I think I was just sort of in awe and connected to the idea of eyeliner being bigger than makeup back then. And then as I sort of came of age, I started to wear it, realizing or understanding that it did have this profound significance as I learned more about it. And I am of part Egyptian ancestry and background. And I also developed an interest in Nefertiti and ancient Egypt because my father was obsessed with those things. And then came to realize also with time the historical significance of Kohl within that context. The earliest iteration of eyeliner is to be found in ancient Egypt. Kohl is to be found in ancient Egypt. So I think after Our Women on the Ground, I mean, I'm fast forwarding many years, but after Our Women on the Ground, I felt like I wanted to write something different, something surprising, something with a focus on culture, especially because I myself have written about culture for many, many years. And I've been obsessed with Middle Eastern culture for many, many years and feel like that's an area that's not sort of explored enough in the mainstream. Not that the mainstream should be what we're gearing towards, but just this idea that I wanted an exploration that was layered. And I was having dinner with a good friend of mine, Azadeh, and we were sort of talking about many things. And then we just started talking about eyeliner, like Sormeh in Iran, Kohl in the Arab world. And I just, it was just this moment where I thought, oh my gosh, this could work so beautifully as an intersectional study of the origins of eyeliner and how it is used across cultures, the differences amongst the cultures, but also the similarities, right? So that was when the idea was like, oh, I could actually take this and kind of explore it as a book idea. So those are the earliest origins up until the point, like the light bulb point.
Yeah, I mean, it's super strong as an idea. I want to, the subline for the title of the book is A Cultural History. So maybe let's start with some of the most simple dots on the line, the longitudinal line. You mentioned that, eyeliner Kohl comes from Egypt. The earliest records are. Can you tell us a little of that story? Not giving away too much from the book, but give us a little bit of that that story.
Yeah, I mean, for context, also, I want to say that Eyeliner is a very character-driven book. So I wanted each chapter to really have a main character, someone that the reader could really learn about in an in-depth way. And for the ancient Egypt chapter, I focused on Nefertiti because Nefertiti, not only was she just such a significant figure in ancient Egypt alongside Pharaoh Akhenaten and sort of the revolutionary periods that they led or spurred, she helped propel the use of eyeliner into the 20th century in the Western world. Because exactly 100 years ago, actually, her bust was displayed to the West, to the world from the West in Berlin. As we know, her bust was stolen from Egypt, I like to say, taken out.
That is the
Egypt
correct verb. That is the correct verb. I encourage that usage.
Yeah, and taken into Berlin and is now being displayed there. And then when her bust was displayed, there was almost an immediate fascination with how beautiful she was, how stunning she was. And many Western women clamored to sort of emulate her look. And one of the tools that they used was Kohl, was eyeliner, because her eyes are very distinctly lined on the bust as she's portrayed on the bust. And, replicas of her bust were then sort of displayed all around the Western world and beyond. It's actually one of the most replicated works of art. And so I kind of studied in the chapter, not just how eyeliner was used in ancient Egypt, but also how Nefertiti propelled the usage of eyeliner into the Western world in the modern era. And of course, this was in the midst of sort of Orientalism or this fascination with Egypt, which is like Egyptomania, which we're all familiar with. But in terms of how eyeliner was used as a pigment in ancient Egypt, the main point really is that it was used for purposes that went far beyond beauty. So it was used for spiritual purposes where it was to guard against the evil eye. It was used to honor the gods. It was used to protect against the glare of the sun, against, medicinal ailments, diseases carried by the Nile, that kind of thing. So it was essentially a protective, cultural sort of artifact or object rather than just simply an item of makeup that made people look really good. At the same time, the aesthetic purpose was also important because sort of use of coal was closely tied to the idea of rebirth, right? So how could you do that? You had to look good to do that. You had to procreate, right? So looking good would help you achieve that spiritual goal, which, essentially for me, it really illustrates that eyeliner or Kohl exists at the intersection or the nexus of like beauty, power, spirituality, identity, religion, all the things. And eyeliner just sits very comfortably there. So there's so many narratives swirling around this one object. And I think what's so fascinating is that the uses in ancient Egypt persisted for centuries and have been sort of replicated across multiple cultures.
So hold on, let me paraphrase that last idea. So in ancient Egypt, wearing kohl, wearing eyeliner, was also a spiritual act, because to make oneself beautiful was part of a spiritual ritual to be able to procreate and engage in this idea of rebirth.
Yeah, so I think even with the aesthetic purpose, there's still this idea of spirituality, right? Yeah, and I love how you actually really clarified that. Yeah, absolutely. So like you were looking hot, but not just for the purpose of looking hot. Like there was an actual goal.
Don't get it twisted. This is a spiritual journey that I'm.
Yeah, and ancient Egyptians used to also bury their coal pots along with them in their tombs. So that would also illustrate just how important coal was, along with other objects that were used for aesthetic purposes.
Yeah, I'm curious in this story that in the sort of the story of the book and the story of eyeliner. At what point does the industry emerge?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, the industry, the modern industry of eyeliner as we know it today, with major cosmetics companies, actually big and small, engaging in it, would have been around the 1920s. So it would have been around the time that there was this widespread fascination in how to achieve the quote unquote Egyptian look. Now, in the years preceding that, there were some, makeup companies that had started to produce kohl. And the understanding is that, a lot of the practice of using kohl would have been brought over to Europe from, when Europeans had embarked on journeys to the Eastern world. As we know that there were many waves of those, and there are actually many texts that show in some of the major Orientalist texts, actually, oftentimes they would describe Arab women or Middle Eastern women or quote unquote Oriental women as having dark and black eyes. So that tradition or documentation of that tradition would have been brought over to Europe through those texts and those accounts. So there were sort of earlier iterations of like darkening of the eye, but it wasn't until really the 1920s and beyond where you had companies like Maybelline or like the modern cosmetic companies that we know of today starting to produce kohl in sort of a more targeted sense with advertising that evoked ancient Egypt. So then it started in that time period, I would say.
It's interesting because like even before the sort of corporatization of the industry, was it exported? I mean, how did it go? Like if we use coffee as a sort of analog, as a comparison, the story of how coffee gets that spreads all over the Arabian Peninsula and then ends up spreading into South Asia and Southeast Asia and into Europe is a story of trade. How did these, essentially these recipes for this concoction get spread? And how did the technique spread from ancient Egypt to places like Iran, modern day Iran, and all over the world?
I mean, I think importantly, what you have to know is that Western concoctions of eyeliner are made from highly processed materials. So it's not that they understood deeply how kohl was produced in ancient Egypt and said, hey, we want to replicate that today. It was more that they wanted to replicate the look itself rather than the ingredients. So in ancient Egypt, kohl would have been made from natural materials or naturally occurring materials like minerals. So it would have been made from galena or malachite, or from sort of the crushing of stone, or the burning of material that would produce soot, and the soot would then be mixed with a liquid to create eyeliner that would then be deposited onto the water lines with an applicator. Not unlike some of the formulations, some of the way the pots are sold today. But I think what I want to say here is that the Western production of eyeliner was made from highly processed materials. It wouldn't be made from the materials that were used in ancient Egypt. So also importantly, studies have shown that some forms of eyeliner in ancient Egypt may have included very, very small traces of lead. So obviously that would not be something that would be used in Western formulations of eyeliner. Even though, I will say, and this has been really interesting, and I just want to make the point that I'm not saying anyone should use any form of lead in their eyes, but the traces of lead that were used, the minute traces of lead that were used, have been shown in studies to provoke an immune response that could actually aid the eyes, depending on any ailments that the eye was experiencing. So that's another interesting element of the research that I did. That remains a huge cause for concern, actually, in some parts of the global South, where lead is still used as an ingredient for Kohl, and of course is advised against. I mean, even the FDA has issued an advisory against the use of any percentage of lead in Kohl. I'm going a little bit into the weeds here, but my main point is that in modern formulations of eyeliner in the Western world, you would not see the same ingredients. Whereas across the global South, and I think this is another interesting element of the research, is that, each country or region that I studied had unique ingredients used to create the Kohl, but I think the commonality was that they're natural ingredients. So I wouldn't say that, one culture, like I wouldn't say that in Japan, they were thinking, oh, in ancient Egypt, they did this, let us do this. It was that in each culture, the decoration of the eye was important, and people used different ingredients to decorate their eyes. For example, in Iran or ancient Persia, nuts were used to create sormeh, and that remains the case today. So yeah, I think that's just sort of a general overview.
Okay, I'm glad you took us there, because I kind of want to just have you talk about the different locations that you explore. So we talked about Egypt a little bit. There's, I think, modern day Chad, Iran, modern day Jordan, India, Japan. I'm not sure if I'm forgetting any, but tell us a little bit of why you chose the characters you chose and the locations you chose.
Sure. I traveled to 6 locations for this book. I went to Jordan, to Petra, to write about the Bedouin community. I went to India. I went to Japan. I went to Germany just to visit Nefertiti's bust. I can't say that that's a location I would have gone to otherwise. And I went to Chad, as you said, and I also went to Los Angeles to write about the Mexican-American community, the Chola, Chicana community. I really wanted to travel to locations that illustrated how diverse the uses of Kohl are, or uses of different variations of eyeliner are, whilst illuminating the context or the culture within which that product is used. And as we know, or as I write about extensively in the book, eyeliner is used quite heavily in the global South. So I had certainly a sort of outweighed interest in traveling to the global South. I did write about Iran as well. Unfortunately, I was not able to travel there because of the protests. I was due to travel the week that the protests against Mahsa Amini's killing started. So unfortunately, I had to cancel that trip and then report from afar. But I think I was just really looking for different communities that use eyeliner in different ways, that had sort of distinct historical context that led to the usage of eyeliner, but that also had some commonalities, a sort of thread. I also reported from New York, where I live, on the drag community. So that was also an important component, because it showed sort of how eyeliner can be used in performance or as sort of a transformative tool and a tool for self-expression as well, especially amongst minority communities. So, yeah, I think that's the through line. I wanted representation across different communities and cultures. I would say there was no shortage of places that I could have gone to. You know, if I could have gone to Yemen or Saudi Arabia, I would have gone. I would have gone to Nepal. I would have gone to South America. There are plenty of cultures, but I had to obviously be selective. I was also traveling during the pandemic, so that was quite challenging.
How did you choose the sort of the character, since you wanted it to be this character-driven narrative?
I did. I wanted it to be character-driven. I think what I did was I made sure to, travel first to those communities. I worked closely with local researchers, people on the ground who could help. And then I just spoke to as many people as I could. And then depending on their comfort levels, I told more of their stories than others. So it just kind of naturally happened. I did write about Amy Winehouse. I had 2 chapters in the West. One of them was on drag, in which actually one of the drag queens is Lebanese, which was really a joy, Anyanese. It was really a joy to speak to him/her. Him went out of costume and her went in costume. And then, for Amy Winehouse, I really wanted to kind of capture the use of eyeliner in the music genre. And to do that, I felt like she was the most iconic singer who had used eyeliner in a very distinct way. So I zeroed in on her. So yeah, I think for each chapter, it just kind of became quite clear who it would be based on the people I interviewed. For Iran, I actually focused on Shereen Nashat, who is a artist who lives here in New York. Yeah, so it just kind of naturally happened just based on the interviews that I conducted.
So somebody from afar, and let's say that somebody is me, could look at Amy Winehouse or Shereen or somebody like that and say, okay, I mean, this is a stylistic choice. It's similar to the way I shave my head or the glasses I wear or the way what clothes I wear. And there isn't much to this. It might just be skin deep. Push back on that. Tell me why I'm fundamentally misunderstanding this. This item, this object, and this sort of choice for these people after having written this book.
Yeah, that's a really good question and one that I'm asked a lot. I mean, sometimes it is skin deep. I don't always think that the use of eyeliner is incredibly profound and layered. I think sometimes people just want to look a particular way, and this is an object that helps them to do that. But I mean, what I try to say in the book is that even then, the origins of the use of eyeliner are quite profound. So therefore, the narratives swirling around it tend to be sort of way more than skin deep. I mean, in the case of Shereen Nashat in particular, she was influenced by how surmay was used in her home country in Iran. And then she melded that into sort of her experiences here when she arrived to America and how she wanted to have a distinct look that celebrated her heritage, but also one that made her feel distinct in a way, right? And that in and of itself already transcends simply the physical because it becomes about identity and belonging. In the case of Amy Winehouse, I think she's quite interesting because she had an amalgamation of influences, from girl groups from the 1960s to Latina women to Betty Boop to Brigitte Bardot to her own grandmother. And she also experienced a lot of criticism for her looks. And she, in a way, really, really wanted to create a very distinct persona. She took all of those influences and she made her own distinct look. And that was within the context of sort of her own personal struggles with her aesthetics and her desire to create a very, very distinct persona when she was in the public eye. And, I think it's important to know that these influences come from somewhere. They don't come from a vacuum, right? Now, it's funny because some people have said, are you implying that white women wearing eyeliner is a form of cultural appropriation? And if so, why would you include Amy Winehouse? I'm not implying that at all. I do want to be clear that I think that the use of eyeliner, when done sensitively in a way that doesn't exoticize and in a way that doesn't sort of try to take a particular aesthetic and claim it as one's own, I think it's absolutely fine to use eyeliner. I think I touch on this in my final chapter on influencers, where there's a trend called fox eye, where certain women were trying to make their eyes look a certain way, which many Asian women found to be very offensive because they grew up being mocked for the way that their eyes looked. And here are Western white women trying to wear their makeup in a way that, you know, gives their eyes a certain look, right? So that is different than somebody who's experimenting with their looks and creating a distinct look and sort of giving credit where credit is due and understanding that their aesthetic comes from a variety of influences. So I know I went in a little bit of a different direction there, but I want to say that it can sometimes be skin deep, but the origin itself says so much more about what eyeliner is and its origins. And to me, I do not look at this as a beauty object. I look at it as a cultural artifact because of the profound significance eyeliner has held in different communities around the world for centuries, especially amongst communities of color. So to anyone who kind of says, oh, this is very superficial and like, actually, you might be playing into this idea that women have to look a certain way, I would respond and say, well, really, it's a cultural artifact and also not one that's limited to women. It's been worn by men and women across the world for centuries.
So talk to me about the men for a second. Because when you go to museums and you see Egyptian art and the representations of these men, they're clearly wearing makeup, right? Mm-hmm. What a 24-year-old person would describe as makeup. Can you give us a little bit of the history of how widely this was used across the entire population? And let's cut across many different aspects of demographics. Was this exclusively used by the rich and the elite? Was this exclusively used in some? Let's use Egypt for example. Was this used in only some professions and stuff like that? Only women? Tell us that story.
Yeah, I mean, eyeliner use was ubiquitous. So in the same way that it's ubiquitous today, it would have been perhaps even more ubiquitous in ancient Egypt. I think that there was a division along class lines for sure, but not in terms of who wore it and who didn't, more in terms of the materials used. So people of a certain class, of an upper class, or, pharaohs and so on would have been using the highest quality of kohl, which would have been made from the materials that I said, like malachite and galena. Whereas sort of people of the, less well-to-do classes would be using materials that could be easily obtained, burned to create soot, and then the soot would then be gathered to become the kohl. So I think in that sense, it was more about the composition of the kohl, also about the pots. So the pots that would have been used by the more wealthy would have been far more ornate and sophisticated and made of higher, composition materials, or better composition materials rather, than what a person who couldn't afford that kind of thing or obtain that kind of thing would be using. And I think that we still see that among some communities today, depending on which communities. That the materials can really vary. In ancient Persia, sometimes there were jewels that would be crushed and used to create a form of eyeliner, right? And somebody poor would not be able to crush jewels with the purpose of making eyeliner. So it's interesting to see that class distinction for sure. But it would have been ubiquitous in the sense that, it was just part of the culture that you were going to be wearing eyeliner, not just to present yourself aesthetically in a certain way, but also because it was important as a tool of protection, to protect against the sun, to protect against the elements, and so on.
So by that logic, the same percentage of men would wear it as women?
Absolutely. There wouldn't be a distinction. It wouldn't be more common that you would see men. I also want to say, to go back,
it would be like wearing. Sorry to interrupt you. It would be the same as glasses. It was just like a protective device, a corrective.
Yeah, especially if you were out in the sun. I mean, if you look at the Bedouin communities, they all wear it to protect their eyes against the glare of the sun. I mean, not all of them, but many would wear it to protect against the glare of the sun. in Petra, for example, certainly the people who worked as tour guides or tourists, anyone who works in tourism, they would all be wearing eyeliner. And some of them would say, oh, we don't even wear sunglasses because we're protected from the glare of the sun. At the same time, they also recognize that, they're doing it for aesthetic purposes and playing into this idea of like what a Bedouin looks like. But, in Chad, for example, all the men and the women were wearing, and it was just sort of part of their daily routine that they would put it on to protect themselves from the sun and for other purposes too.
Yeah. It's like a skin block.
Yes.
Sunblock.
Yeah. And then also for cultural purposes, like in South Asia, as a protective measure against the evil eye, for example, sometimes people apply it to their babies when they're newborns. And this is in other parts of Asia and Africa too. So again, it's just such a cultural artifact that it's not really viewed as something that would, in some way, be more of an onus on the woman than the man. And then we can also get into the religious element, if you'd like, on Muslims and,
yes, please.
And eyeliner.
Yeah.
Which was definitely one of my favorite parts of the research, because I read many hadith about eyeliner use. The Prophet Muhammad was said to have worn ithmet, which was considered to be sort of the purest form of eyeliner made from antimony and other materials. And he wore it per hadith to treat his eyes medicinally, even to thicken the eyelashes and for other purposes. It was believed also to strengthen the eyesight and so on. So there's also hadith that says that in heaven, in the afterlife, the mu'min, the person who's in heaven would be gifted with three things, which would be a hairless body, no hair on their body, clothes that never wear out, and kohl for the eyes. So that was really fascinating that, amongst three things that you're promised, this is one thing. So that to me is also fascinating because, amongst Muslim communities, it's considered sunnah or permissible to wear eyeliner. And therefore you see large groups of men, even the Taliban. I mean, many people don't associate them with beautification, but, they wear eyeliner quite heavily. And they consider that to be just the way of the Prophet, right? So you would see that in many Muslim communities. Some men might wear it when they go to the mosque. Some might wear it during Ramadan. Some might wear it on Eids, that kind of thing. So it plays a significant role in Islam in that regard. To the extent that the United Arab Emirates actually issued a fatwa saying that wearing kohl is permissible so long as you don't do it to attract attention from like the opposite sex.
Is that something that surprised you? Was this like a gem that you found? Did you know that growing up?
I had a sort of a vague awareness of it, but it's not something that I had, I didn't realize that it was in the hadith. Sorry, I've got to put my charger on. I didn't realize that it was in the hadith, for example. I didn't realize that it was mentioned by numerous Islamic scholars. Al-Ghazali mentions it. It's mentioned in other texts, ancient texts. Even pre-Islam in the Jahiliyyah period, it was worn as well. But interestingly, this is one of my favorite parts of the research, was that in the Jahiliyyah period, it was more closely associated with women than men. So it had sort of that gender dynamic pre-Islam. But then when Islam came, when the Prophet, was said to have worn it, other people started emulating him, and then it had less of a gendered distinction at that point, which was really interesting to me to kind of see how you went from the Islamic text to the post, how there was this sort of big difference in how it was worn and perceived to be worn.
Yeah. So if you were to, I'm going to bring a little hip hop into this. If you were to put together sort of top 5 dead or alive eyeline wearers, through the research, have you sort of had a list of your absolute favorites? You're like, okay, this is the rock star list. Like, these are the, if we're only to have 5, who's at the top of the charts for you?
Wow. I mean, even though we didn't know how the Prophet Muhammad looked, I would say that he would be there because he influenced so many generations of Muslims to continue to wear eyeliner in a particular way. I would definitely say Nefertiti for sure. Like I said, she's absolutely influenced generations of people to wear it, and they continue to emulate her look today. I would also say Amy Winehouse, who I've already touched on, because I think, at least in the modern era, nobody has really been able to exist in the imagination in the same way that Amy Winehouse has, because of how distinctly she wore it. Also, back to ancient Egypt, I think the Eye of Horus. The Eye of Horus is really important because of this element of sort of, firstly, the lines were distinct to the way that Nefertiti wore hers. So they're like kind of two parallel lines that travel to the temples. And that's sort of extremely distinct as a look. And then that leaves me with a fifth person who I'm trying to think. Well, I think actually a good, and this wouldn't be one person, it would be numerous people. But in Nepal, you have this, the idea of a living goddess who is just a beautiful young woman who carries sort of spiritual and religious meaning in that context, who wears very, very heavy eyeliner. And the living goddesses, there are multiple living goddesses. So that's more conceptual and less sort of just one person. But that's also a really fascinating insight into that sort of the importance of eyeliner within that regional context. So the living goddesses in Nepal. I would love to do a chapter on that too at some point, not for this book, maybe in the future.
Second edition.
Yeah.
I want to ask about the instruments, like across all these geographies. What similarities and differences did you observe in terms of the application instruments, the instruments to create the actual material, but also the instruments to apply them?
Yeah. Great question. You're coming at me with all the good questions, Mikey. I think it's one of my favorite quotes in the book was actually from an author called Judith Illes. And she says, an ancient Egyptian woman transported to the modern era would be confused by so much, but if you hand her eyeliner and the applicator of eyeliner, it's one thing she would recognize, which I absolutely love, because actually, usually what you would have is some form of a pot with an applicator that goes into the pot with the pigment at the bottom of the pot. So you wouldn't have pens and pencils like you would see today, but still on the market, even in the West and all over the global South, you do see the same type of structural pots. It usually has sort of a thin entry point and then gets a little bit bigger towards the bottom to keep all the pigment, and the applicator goes into the pot and you take it out and you'll have the pigment deposited on it. And then usually you will need some form of a liquid to allow the pigment then to be deposited onto the eye. But structurally, the pots have actually looked the same for centuries, and the same way that they might have looked. They were quite ornate in Egypt. So actually in ancient Egypt, they were actually a lot more beautiful, frankly, than they are today, than what you might find today. But you still have across the region, especially in the Arab world, actually, you still have very sophisticated Kohl pots. A lot of these Kohl pots, by the way, are being held in museums all over the Western world. Kohl pots from all over the region, including ancient Egypt. I guarantee you'll find one if you live in the West and go to a museum. They're also made from really beautiful materials. There's some silk was sometimes used, bone was used, gold was used. In terms of what I'm actually focusing more right now on what you might find in the East, in terms of what you find in the West at like Duane Reade or Boots or Walgreens, you find sort of very just simple pencils and pens. Although you still do have those kinds of pots made by certain cosmetics companies. They'll kind of call it Kohl or Kajal, which is how it's referred to in South Asia. But in general, you'll have a pot and then an applicator if it's not a pencil or a pen.
When did the pencil or pen first emerge as a widespread tool, instrument?
Great question. Actually, in the 1920s with Maybelline. Maybelline initially started creating sort of eyebrow pencils that people were then utilizing to wear to wear eyeliner along their waterline. So they would take the eyebrow pencil and then sort of use it as eyeliner. And then many other cosmetics companies started coming up with the idea of a pencil or a pen for eyeliner as well.
So if I were to sit in on marketing meetings at Maybelline in the 1920s, would they have been saying, "Oh, we need to create a Nefertiti pen"? I mean, what would they have been saying? How did they think of this item?
I mean, there was actually one company that used Nefertiti in its advertising. It's now defunct. It was called Aziza. But yeah, Maybelline was heavily influenced by the trends of Egyptomania. I even spoke to a relative, a descendant of I think it might be a great niece. I interviewed her. She has a book called The Maybelline Story, which I had read for the purposes of the research. And she said, yes, absolutely. The trends of Egyptomania really influenced the decisions of Maybelline to pursue sort of aggressively marketing eyeliner. I also did a lot of research in like beauty magazines and so on, not just in terms of the pieces they wrote, but the advertisements that they featured. And there was a copious amount of pieces that were doing deep dives into the ancient Egyptian aesthetic with Nefertiti as someone that women should aspire to look like. I will say also some of that was extremely Orientalist / racist. You know, in one piece that I found, it was something that it said something along the lines of, if you want to line your eyes like Nefertiti, use Kohl, but careful, don't darken your skin. Like, you know, keep your skin the same tone that it is now, because you kind of, it's like cherry picking, right? You don't want to look too brown. Like, then let's take this one feature from them. Brown or black. We don't officially know the race of Nefertiti. She was very likely brown or potentially black. That's a whole other discussion. So yeah, it was around the 1920s that started.
Okay, it's a discussion I want to have. Okay, I'll tell you why I want to have this discussion. Because I brought up coffee earlier, and there's this interesting soft power war happening, in particular in the Gulf, over the origins of coffee. And everyone is very much positioning themselves as we are the inheritors of this story, and of this universal drink. And it's, if you have a good sense of humor, it's kind of hilarious to see ad campaigns and the soft power maneuvering of various governments. And I'm curious if there is a similar maneuvering happening in Egypt. There was this like big hullabaloo recently when the Netflix show came out. I think it was a Netflix show about Cleopatra. And is she Greek? Is she black? Is she not black? Is she Egyptian? Is she this? Is she that? And that sent waves into academic circles and historians who all felt compelled to comment on it. I'm curious, when it comes to the history of eyeliner, is the state of Egypt also claiming this as an Egyptian product?
I mean, it's generally agreed upon, amongst historians and archaeologists that eyeliner originated in ancient Egypt. Now, I don't think that is a question at all. I think the question over sort of the racial identity of ancient Egyptians becomes something else, right? Now, interestingly, and this was, again, one of the most fascinating parts of my research, was that in the context of celebrating the achievements of ancient Egyptians, amongst them eyeliner, there has been historically, especially in the US, a movement amongst sort of the Afrocentric community to reclaim Nefertiti as being a Black queen, versus sort of any form of whitewashing that has happened over the past century. And there certainly has been whitewashing. There certainly have been depictions of Nefertiti that attempt to say that she was very fair-skinned. And the same has happened with Cleopatra, even though with Cleopatra, she's very clearly at least half Macedonian / Greek. What I tend to say, and I don't come to any conclusions in my book, especially when it comes to Cleopatra, I just state what we know factually. But what I tend to say is what many historians have said, which is that it's sort of anachronistic to apply modern conceptions of race to ancient communities. We do know that ancient Egyptians were actually multiracial. So you had people of different races depending on, what part of Egypt they were from. We also know very much so that there were many Black ancient Egyptians, as there are many Black Egyptians today. And I think it's important to acknowledge, especially with Nefertiti, she was most certainly a woman of color. She was very likely Black. Historians have said that we do not know conclusively that she was Black, but also there are studies that show she may have been from the Mitanni kingdom, so she could have had Syrian/Levantine ancestry. She also could have been related to a pharaoh, but we know certainly that she was a woman of color. Now, there have been exhibits that have tried to sort of frame her as being Black, and that's absolutely fair in my opinion. And then there have been exhibits actually that show her bust in many different shades, pointing to the fact that we don't know really what her race was. But amongst the Afrocentric movement, as I said, you have singers like Rihanna, Beyonce, Queen Latifah, people evoking the ancient Egyptian look or aesthetic and using eyeliner to do that as a way to sort of flick at this idea that there were so many ancient Egyptian, kings and queens and so on, who are Black, which is absolutely fair and correct. We don't know exactly who or what skin tone and that kind of thing, but I think it's fair to position those kings and queens as potentially being Black. I am not I would not waste any time trying to argue certain people are not Black. I think white supremacy has dictated for so long this kind of whitewashing. At the same time, I also understand that the Egyptians have their own view and this idea of let's just portray them as Egyptian. And within that framework, there's sort of this racial dynamic. It's just kind of a minefield. So like I said, I go back to this idea that it's anachronistic to apply our conceptions of race to that time period because we don't definitively know and because it was a multiracial society. But eyeliner, certainly within the context of this debate, has been used as a tool to express a form of sort of pride in the aesthetic of the time within the context of, well, these are contributions of people of color, Black or brown people, to the beauty industry and to the history, the great history of this civilization.
Yeah. Okay. I love it. Before I let you go, because this is Ehkili, which is our book club, do you have any book recommendations for people to check out? Could be recent books, old books, stuff that's sort of on your bookshelf these days?
Sure. Before that, do you mind if we just touch on Palestine for a little bit?
Please, absolutely. I should say before you touch on it, we're recording this on March 27th for context, given we don't know when this is coming out. But go ahead, please.
Absolutely. I kind of want to mention Palestine in the context of eyeliner, which may feel a little bit sort of jarring and unexpected, just because I think eyeliner is such an important tool for the expression of one's heritage and identity and ancestry amongst many communities. I mean, in Iran, you see Iranian women using it, of course, in the specific context of their bodies being policed and a form of self-expression for them, or sometimes just because they like eyeliner. Again, it's not always so deep. You see Mexican-American cholas wearing it as an expression of their identity, a rejection of assimilating into Anglo-American culture, and them having pride in their aesthetic and wanting to use eyeliner as a tool to express that. And then what I think is really important in the context of Palestine is cultural erasure, where Palestinians are experiencing cultural erasure, attempted cultural erasure by the Israeli military, where you have many cultural buildings that have been destroyed. And, how does eyeliner come into this? Kohl, or the making of Kohl making, is actually very important in Gaza and in Palestinian culture in general, and across the Arab world, especially in rural communities. It is a tradition that has been passed on for many generations, whereby grandmothers will teach their daughters, who will then teach their daughters how to make Kohl at home. And in that context, I think it's important to flick at this idea of this is a preservation of one's culture and one's identity, but also sort of a resistance to any attempt to culturally erase a community. This is a fundamental part of Arab and Palestinian culture, one that many Palestinians take great pride in, and something that I just really wanted to highlight in the context of what is happening now in Gaza, that it is so important for us to celebrate and preserve and protect these traditions.
Yeah, for sure. It's It's so true. You are in New York right now. I mean, when you're living and working in New York, sometimes that's very much like the rubber hitting the road. And that sense of like erasure can be felt quite clearly. Since this book came out, or I guess I should say since October 7th, have you felt people's reactions to the book, who you're just talking to, has changed? Like, oh, this is you're fighting erasure now. This is a little less okay for you to be fighting this erasure.
Yeah, I mean, I think importantly, I want to say that, what I'm doing is just a tiny contribution to this idea of celebrating and preserving culture, right? And I understand deeply the gravity of what is happening in Palestine. I think what I try to say is that so often, we discuss trauma, and so often we highlight and amplify the themes of trauma around what's happening. And to go back to how we started this podcast, where it's important also to discuss culture because it is a fundamental part of who we are. Now, I was nervous about the book coming out at this point in time because of how, people might perceive of it. And how do I talk about eyeliner, at such a great time? And I actually talked about this with Hannah Alian, who's a friend of mine, and she'd said it's so important to hold so many truths at the same time, right? It can be true that we need to talk about the grief and the trauma, and it can also be true and important that we need to talk about other things and also experience moments of joy. And I think in general, people actually have really received my book quite well in the context of, oh, well, this is delightful. It's surprising. It's also adding another layer to something that people don't immediately understand as being quite profound in terms of our culture. And I think, to me, that's very gratifying because it says, okay, we understand the gravity of what's happening. We understand how difficult the current moment is. And we can also read a book like this and find it joyful and celebratory whilst having all those themes swirling around it, which tend to be quite profound as well. But there's a place for this, right? And that, to me, is what I've taken away. Now, some people don't like that I've highlighted communities of color in my book. Somebody said something like, why didn't you write about the Vikings? Which I found to be very funny because I just think, how about you go ahead and write the Vikings, where I write the book about Vikings wearing eyeliner? That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to deflect from the Western gaze. I'm trying to get people to think, in post-colonial terms, in anti-colonial terms, and also to decolonize our own minds by thinking, by centering our own cultures within different contexts and getting people to think of us in this way, because that also helps humanize us, right? It gives a fuller picture of the lives that we live. And I think that a lot of people are catching on to that, which is great.
Yeah. The answer is, tfaddali, please write the book about the Vikings.
Yeah.
Like, I'll buy it.
Yeah.
Wallah, I will.
It's exactly. I would gladly read it. But that's not what I was seeking to do with my book, right? That's not what I was seeking to do. Yeah.
Anjad. Okay. I'm glad that you said that, Zahra. Thanks. Okay. So, but about these recommendations, right before we wrap up.
Yes.
So tell me, give us a few books on your bedside table or on your shopping cart that you are excited about.
So I just read Doppelganger by Naomi Klein, which I loved. I think was fantastic. I'm reading now A Day in the Life of Abd Salama by Nathan Thrall. And I'm also reading Three Worlds, which is a book by Avi Shleim, the academic, about being an Arab Jew. It's his memoir, which is really interesting too. So I'm kind of alternating between those two books right now on my bedstand, on my nightstand.
Amazing. For those listening to the podcast, we literally saw Zahra's eyes turn to her bedstand to look at it. look at the actual bedside table. Zahra, it's so nice to speak to you. People can find you online very easily. Zahra Hankir is Hankir. This is the book. I'm thrilled that this actually happened. It's cool to hold it in my hands, and it's really inspiring to see the fruits of all your intense labor. So
Thank you, Mikey.
Thanks so
It's
much.
an absolute joy to speak to you, and hopefully, we'll have dinner again in Brooklyn soon.
And you can tell me about your next book project.
Indeed.
Okay.
Indeed.
Yalla. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.